So I've lived in Japan for 10 years now, and I speak Japanese fluently enough to use it for business, but Matt here is the best non-native Japanese speaker I've met, and he reached this level in about 5 years while living in the United States.
Really good, like crazy good.
In this video, I'm chatting with Matt about the somewhat unorthodox method he used for learning Japanese that you could apply to any language. Something interesting about Japanese specifically is that many people achieve fluency, but they don't quite get themselves to sound like a native.
その卵のちょうどいいふわふわした感じとか、もちろん肉の
Matt, on the other hand, has nearly mastered an aspect of Japanese that some learners don't even realize exists. This is why Japanese people will actually mistake Matt for a Japanese person if they hear him but don't see him.
1番と3番の違いって、
はい、1番と3番ね。お、すごい。お上手で日本。もうすごい今完璧でも。
俺もね、言われるまでね、日本人だと思ってた。
We talk here about how he was able to do this, misunderstandings about language learning, the most efficient way to acquire a language, why we process language in a certain way, and so on.
Yeah, so I think you actually had a video a couple years ago on input and Stephen Krashen, and my method was very much based on his ideas, which basically say that the most important thing when it comes to learning a language is getting input, or in other words, listening to and reading in that language. So this means that rather than working a lot on trying to speak a lot or trying to write a lot, I really was just focused on getting as much Japanese as I could into my head. And so I was basically watching tons of anime. I also watched a lot of Japanese drama and read a lot of Japanese books. I read a lot of light novels and just general novels in Japanese. And so the bulk of my method is really just consuming content. And I wasn't using any English subtitles. I was watching the original content, not simplified or adulterated in any way, the same type of content that Japanese people would be watching. And what I would do is whenever I came across words that I didn't know, I would make a flashcard for them in a spaced repetition system called Anki. So this is basically an electronic flashcard program that has an algorithm which determines the optimal time for you to review all of your flashcards so that you can remember as much as possible with as little review as possible. So it was really just a matter of diving in, consuming tons of content, memorizing all the things I didn't know with Anki, and then by the time I, maybe a couple years had passed, around 2 years, I had gotten to the point where I could understand really, really well. And then when I started having opportunities to speak, I found that the speaking ability came pretty naturally.
すみません、ペンなんですけど、その一番細いのって何があります？
ボールペンでしたら0.28。
It was really just a matter of imitating the language that I had heard so many times. And because language tends to be pretty patterned and
ご覧のスポンサーの提供でお送りします。
ご覧のスポンサーの提供でお送りします。
like the same types of things tend to be said in the same types of situations. I could say the things that I'd heard Japanese people say so many times, and the result was that I was sounding kind of like a Japanese person would sound.
That's funny that you say that, because it's really similar to what I did to achieve some level of fluency, but of course I wasn't near as diligent. I wasn't using Anki as much, but I listened over and over again to this drama called Kekkon Dekinai Otoko, and when I would be talking to people, it was almost like I could hear Abe Hiroshi's voice like telling me what to say.
何にしますか?
肉だな。
I just allowed the content to really teach me, and I knew whether my understanding was correct or not based on whether it made sense in the context. You know, like if you think that a word means like A, but then in a certain context A would make absolutely zero sense to say, then you realize that your understanding was probably wrong.
これは鳩ですか?
So people a lot of times they think that, oh, if I just learn from immersion, then won't I develop all these misunderstandings and misconstruals and things like that? And the answer is, first of all, less than you'd think because you're smart. But second of all, even if you do come up with some misunderstandings, which inevitably will happen here or there, they'll eventually get sorted out naturally because you'll eventually come across enough situations where that interpretation doesn't make sense that you'll have to re-question your interpretation.
That's an interesting point because that's actually one of the detriments of learning in a really formal setting. These formal settings are teaching you via this thing that you're trying to express in English is expressed this way in Japanese. So you're getting this like this concept in English to this concept in Japanese. So then very quickly you're going to run into so many situations where in your head it'll sound correct, like you're able to say the thing that you are thinking of in English, you're able to say it in Japanese, but then it doesn't fit the context, or it's just really unnatural, or people would just use a totally different word.
Yeah, exactly. That's such an important point when we're talking about learning a language that is so different than your native language. So like we're English speakers. When we're learning Japanese, Japanese is so fundamentally different that if you actually try to learn through English interpretation or English translation, you'll end up with this kind of misconstrued model of the language, because really you can't just take your model of English and then apply some patch on top and then get Japanese. You can get something that like kind of looks like Japanese and that will work for like very basic things. But if you really want to get sophisticated and sound natural, you have to throw your English model out the window and build kind of a whole new conceptual web and conceptual model from scratch of like, how do you express high level ideas using words?
I was just talking to my friend yesterday, and he was talking about a Polish person. Maybe you've heard about him. And he was saying that if your aim is to be mistaken for a native, at least in English, then you'll want to take a different approach from what a baby would do for learning the language. The difference is that the baby is receiving corrections from the person they're talking to, but they're also constructing like their view of the world with the language. Their view of the world, their concept of what is valuable in the culture, and all these different things are constructed with the language. So that's why it's appropriate for a baby to learn language the way they do. But for an adult, because you have all these concepts already hardwired, and you don't really get, because people aren't jerks, so they're not just going to correct you right away, then your approach to learning the language should be different. Have you ever heard of that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I mean, one is actually, it's a really common idea that the reason why children end up sounding native in their language is because they receive lots of corrections. But there's actually a lot of linguistic evidence that children don't respond to corrections at all. And there's there's actually a really good video on YouTube summarizing this. I can give you the link to put in the description. But a lot of times, basically the deal is that children, the way that they learn language is through pattern recognition, right? They're fed all this input and they're constantly trying to update their model of how the language works in light of that data. So if they notice a new pattern, they kind of come up with a hypothesis of, oh, maybe the language works like this. And if that ends up being predictive in terms of it allows them to understand more of the language or speak the language better, then, they go with that hypothesis, and if it gets disproven, then they won't. And so at any given point in time, a child's understanding of the language is based on all the different sentences that they've heard in that language up until that point. And so if you correct a child, you're giving them one piece of counter evidence to their current model. That's not the way that it's not going to be enough to overwrite all the evidence that they have on their own, right? One additional sentence. They've already taken in probably hundreds of thousands of sentences or whatever. And so really it's just the inherent language acquisition device inside of the child's brain that eventually arrives at the perfect model given enough data. And there's even examples of for example, there's people who grew up not being able to speak in any way because of some kind of birth defect or something. And then later in life, due to some kind of technology, they become able to write. And we find that they can write perfectly grammatical speech right off the bat because they were getting input their entire life.
Most of her life, Carly Fleischman was dismissed as mentally impaired. But 3 years ago came an astonishing breakthrough. Carly began not only to type, but to unlock the mysteries behind her often wild behavior.
If I could stop it, I would, but it's not like turning a switch off. I know what is right and wrong, but it's like I have a fight with my brain over it.
And so it seems like even in the case of first language acquisition, correction doesn't actually play that big of a role. But I'd still say there are differences between the way an infant learns and the way an adult learns. Because, for example, I regularly looked words up in the dictionary and I made flashcards and reviewed flashcards. Infants don't do that when they're learning their native language. So I consider this to be, I'm using my model of the world and just my more developed cognitive capacities to help me learn more quickly. And the mechanism I view is that, like I mentioned earlier, the linguist Stephen Krashen said that we acquire language when we understand messages in the language.
We call this comprehensible input. We've tried everything else. We've tried grammar teaching, drills and exercises, computers, but the only thing that seems to count is getting messages you understand, comprehensible input. So anything that helps make input comprehensible, pictures, knowledge of the world, realia, etc., helps language acquisition.
That's really that's the mechanism through which input works. And so consciously memorizing grammar rules and vocabulary doesn't lead to intuitive language ability. It doesn't lead to language acquisition, but through memorizing grammar and vocabulary, we can become able to understand more of the language. And through that understanding, that's how our intuitive ability grows. So it wasn't that I was memorizing words with the flashcards so that I could use those words. I was memorizing what they meant so that when they came up when I was watching anime or something, I would understand that. And through understanding them in a natural context, that's how I would acquire them and become able to use it myself. So I think using your conscious mind to become able to understand more quickly speeds up the whole acquisition process in a way that infants couldn't do.
When I was in college, I was taking a Japanese course, and for the most part, it didn't feel like it was helping me quite at all until we had to memorize these lists of vocabulary. And then when I was watching whatever drama it might have been I was watching at the time, because I wasn't using subtitles, I would be like, oh, I know that word. And then that whole sentence, it felt like a video game. You plug in the word and it's like, unlock. The whole phrase made sense, and it actually stuck with me. You, of course, did tons of input. You did massive input. But do you think that there's a specific way of input that has to be done? It's not practice makes perfect. It's perfect practice makes perfect. Does it have to be perfect input, or can it just be pretty much anything? Like you could just look at a receipt or...
Well, I think that probably there are some bare minimum requirements that have to be met in order for the input to really have any positive effect. But after that, I think it's more a matter of degree of efficiency. There's definitely, we can kind of envision an ideal form of input that has various qualities that I can explain. And the closer you are to that, then the more beneficial it's going to be. So basically, if we were going to talk about what is the most ideal possible language input, first of all, it's comprehensible, but still contains language that you haven't mastered yet. Because if it only contains things that you've already mastered, then you're not going to learn anything new by consuming it. So it has to have something new, but once you have some new content in there, then basically the more comprehensible, the better, because that's going to allow you to acquire more. And then second of all, you want it to be naturally entertaining and engaging to you, because when we're consuming content that we're naturally engaged in, I think that's when our brain really kicks in and we learn the most. And then third, you want it to be language dense in the sense of, a lot of people ask if playing video games are good for language learning, and they can be, but the downside is that if you're playing, like, for example, an RPG, then there are going to be long periods of time where there's almost no actual language use, right? You're just in a battle and you're just doing the same moves over and over again. And so you might play for an hour, but you only really were contacting the language for like 20 minutes. Whereas if you sit down and read a book or listen to an audiobook, well, that's going to be basically very language dense as an activity. You're going to be there's almost going to be no blank space at all. So you want language input that's totally dense, as well as comprehensible and engaging. And so the further you are from any of those three ideals, the less effective it's going to be. But a lot of times you do have to make some sort of compromise, just because if one of the other traps that people fall into is instead of actually getting input, they spend all their time looking for the perfect input. And it's hard to find something that's truly perfect. So it's more a matter of trying to find some sort of balance between those three factors and just going with it. Because in almost any input, there's going to be, like, assuming that you have at least some foundation in the language, like you've learned the most common 500 words at least and have read like the 2-page grammar guide, there's going to be some things that are comprehensible. Not a lot, but some. And if there's some things that are comprehensible, then you can experience that phenomenon that you just explained where, you look one thing up and you unlock it, or you learn a new word and then that unlocks the meaning of a sentence. And so if you can understand some sentences here or there, then that's enough for you to unlock the next layer. And once you unlock that next layer, then you can unlock the one after that, and you kind of build on it progressively and get better and better. But of course, if you're starting off only understanding one sentence for every like 10 minutes that you listen to, a lot of that time is being wasted and you're not really learning. So you can learn from very incomprehensible input. It's just going to take a while and be kind of slow. So ideally, you find something that's a little more comprehensible to get started with.
Did you ever experience that you could look up a word after you watched a movie or whatever it might be, and then you're like retroactively understanding things in the movie?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this type of learning works so well is because the brain likes to solve real problems. You know, a lot of times when you're in school or you're in a classroom, you're solving fake problems, right? It doesn't really matter whether you write this paper well or not, because no one's going to read the paper and learn something, right? Only the teacher's going to read it, and only to give you a grade. And so a lot of we try to fool our brains, but really we're too smart for that. We know that we're doing a meaningless activity that's not really going to end up doing anything for anyone. Whereas if we're trying to watch a movie that we actually like and we're interested in, then now the act of understanding the language is actually relevant to us in a really direct way. And so our brain's going to want to understand it. It's going to feel like, man, there are messages being expressed, and I want to know what they mean. The content of these messages are important, and I can't understand them yet because I don't know the language. And so I think that really kicks the brain into gear when it comes to noticing all those patterns, figuring out all those patterns, and acquiring the language. And that's why you can, you know, look up a word and retroactively have that insight of like, oh, that's what that scene meant. Because your brain, that during that scene, it was trying to figure it out, and it's still holding it somewhere in the back of your mind, like, oh, well, what did that thing mean? It's like that's why, you know, a lot of times in any skill, right, you practice and then you go to sleep, you wake up and you're better. And what that tells you is that even while you were sleeping, your brain was still figuring out how that activity works. And so that's definitely the same thing with language learning.
Japanese is a very high context language. Do you think that you did anything in particular to help you get used to that fact, or did you do anything unique to Japanese to make yourself learn Japanese more effectively, you know, compared to, say, if you were learning Italian or something like that?
Yeah, well, I think something that helped me out in that area is just being very curious about the language. So, you know, in Japanese, there's a lot of words that meaningly mean the same thing, like iru versus irasharu. Like, they technically both mean to be for animate objects, but irasharu is more polite and used in other contexts. And then there's like 4 other words that also mean the same thing, but are slightly different. So when I would come across these things that seem to be almost the same, I would always ask myself, like, okay, why do these 2 different things exist? What is the difference? And I'd try to keep noticing the pattern. And of course, it's hard to not be aware of the fact that, yeah, Japanese is very contextual. There's many different registers of the language that are used in different situations. So I just always try to pay attention to that in my input. You know, I'd pay attention if there was a scene where there's a business meeting, what particular verb conjugations do they use in that situation versus if it's casual. And so I think that helped me out as well, just in general. Also consuming a really wide range of media. Like I would watch genres of all genres. I'd watch the news. I'd read novels of all genres, nonfiction books. And so that, like, having a really wide range of language gives you a good sense of, like, how does the language differ depending on the context. But also, so for the first 3 years of me, you know, getting input as much as I could, you know, 6 to 8 hours a day and learning the language, I wasn't really speaking at all. I was mostly just alone in my room, besides the first 6 months where I was actually in Japan. Then around the 3-year mark, I transferred into a 4-year university where there was a lot of Japanese foreign exchange students. And so this allowed me to start actually making Japanese friends in real life and hanging out with groups of Japanese people and really speaking the language every day. And like I mentioned earlier, by the time this happened, I was able to speak really fluently, but there were definitely a lot of those cultural aspects that I hadn't fully mastered yet. And that was also kind of a rude awakening for me to realize that basically I had gotten good in a very technical sense when it came to using the language, but when it came to social skills, my Japanese social skills were at 0 because there's totally different rules when it comes to this Japanese social game. You know, there's this whole concept of reading the atmosphere and things like that. And so it took a lot of hanging out with Japanese people, making some close Japanese friends who were willing to be brutally honest with me about all the things that maybe I did that wouldn't have been normal if I was Japanese, or would have been a little off if I was Japanese, and that helped as well. But I still think as well that that particular aspect is something that if I had the opportunity to move to Japan, which hopefully I will in a couple years or something, then there's still room for improvement. You know, like when it comes to really using the perfect level of politeness or the perfectly formed Japanese for each particular context, I think you have to actually live through each of those contexts to really master that. But I think because I have such a strong foundation in speaking the language colloquially and just a really wide range of input, I'll be able to pick up the various situations that I'm not familiar with yet really quickly.
Everyone's going to have different goals for learning a language, but then there's so many things you have to learn that are not necessarily just the language itself, right? How come you didn't choose to... I would have thought at halfway through, you'd be like, wow, I've come this far. I should probably just go live in Japan. Was there a specific reason for that, or you just simply had some obligations that didn't allow you to leave the country?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, when I was at my 4-year university, I was pretty much all signed up for a study abroad program where I would go and go to college in Japan and actually take classes in Japanese and live there for a year. But it was right around that point that I kind of basically started to question whether I really wanted to continue down this path of dedicating myself to Japanese and Japanese culture. And basically what had kind of happened was I got really interested in Japanese when I was in high school, and there were a lot of different kind of factors of what drove me to really throw myself into Japanese. Part of it was just that I felt a real connection to the culture, and I found the language very beautiful, and I just had a genuine interest in that. But another component was that I was kind of searching for a new identity because, you know, I mean, that's what happens when you're a freshman in high school. You know, I wasn't one of the popular kids, and that was really disturbing for me. And so I was just looking for some kind of new identity, some new way to rebrand myself. And Japan and like being the white guy who masters Japanese was going to be my new identity. And I wasn't conscious that that's what I was doing at the time. I just convinced myself that I loved Japan. But really later on, I realized that Japan had been fulfilling a sort of role for me in the sense of being a foundation of my self-esteem and my self-confidence. And so it was around that point, around the end of my 5-year period of doing Japanese all the time, where I started to become aware of that and then really question, like, do I even really love Japan as much as I say that I do? Or am I just trying to convince myself that I do because I've built my whole life around it and I have this sunk cost fallacy? And so I decided to kind of take some... And also I just realized I don't know who I am outside of Japan, and that felt really unhealthy. So I kind of took a few steps back and took some, you know, had some space from Japan and Japanese for a while. And that allowed me to kind of really view Japan in a more objective light and notice that, yeah, there's a lot of amazing things about Japanese and Japanese culture that I really love. It's also just become a part of me now. And also, of course, it's a country on earth that has a lot of problems, and there's a lot of aspects of Japanese culture that I don't really resonate with, and that's totally okay. And so now I have a more healthy relationship with Japan, and I think I would like to go to Japan now because I think it would be cool to kind of ride that line between Japanese person and foreigner, and I'm in a good position to do that, you know, being a foreigner and knowing Japanese. And I mean, now it's the pandemic, so it's kind of hard to plan anything, but that's kind of, yeah, why up until now it's taken me a while, but it's definitely something that I would like to do.
At this point, my friend showed up to chat with Matt in Japanese.
こんにちは。
こんにちは。すごい上手。
いえいえ。
上手早すぎるから、なんかちゃんと話して。
だってもうすぐわかるもん。
マットです。よろしくお願いします。
すごい。よろしくお願いします。日本にはいないのに、そんなに上手に喋れるようになったんですか？
はい、そうですね。まあ、結構前に半年だけ日本に住んだことあるんですけど、もう結構、まあ、アメリカに住みながら日本語を覚えたっていうのが、まあ、自分の、なんだろう、まあ、一応 YouTuber やってるんですけど、それにおける、なんだろう、俺のチャンネルの見る価値というか、
すごい。
日本にいなくても日本語なんか俺が日本語を覚えることができたから、日本にいなくても君たちも日本語を覚えることができますよっていうのが、 そう。
じゃあ私も海外にいなくても英語が喋れるようになる。
絶対そうですよ。絶対そうですよ。
嘘でしょ。
マットとジョセフの日本語の差、なんだろう。
違うね。
でも表現して
まあ全然不自由はないっていうか、すごい通じないことはほとんどないんだけど、やっぱ発音はその日本人じゃないってことはすぐわかるっていう感じ。
ああ、なるほど。
でもマットさんは、
ね、
多分これは結構日本人かもって勘違いしちゃう人が多いと思う。すごい、なんかそうですかとかっていう反応の仕方とかも、なんだろう、何かな。発音、イントネーションだけじゃなくて、タイミングとか使い方とかも、ちょっと日本人っぽい。
嬉しいです。
言葉の
これからも頑張ります。
選び方とかも、すごい。はい、ありがとうございました。バイバイ。
So that's a good segue into pitch accent.
In Japanese, there's this phonetic concept called pitch accent. It's kind of similar to tones in Chinese, which probably more people have heard of. But basically, the rise and fall of pitch as you pronounce a word in Japanese is part of it's a fundamental component of the pronunciation of words.
いいですよ。いいですよ。くまモンなの？くまモンなのっていうこと。
So in English, we have stress accent, which means that one syllable within a word is going to be more emphasized than another word. Like, for example, if we say addict versus addict, it changes the word, right? And a lot of words, and this doesn't necessarily, or just another example. So if I said tomorrow, it sounds natural. If I said tomorrow, that sounds weird. Like tomorrow, I'm going to go to the doctor. You know, sometimes second language speakers will speak like that. They'll put the accent on the wrong word. And so in Japanese, instead of one just being more emphasized, it will be pronounced higher or lower. So for example, if you say hashi, that means chopstick. But if you say hashi, that means bridge. And so this aspect of Japanese is really difficult for a lot of foreigners, particularly English speakers or Europeans, because in most European languages and English, there's no real connection between changes in pitch and the lexical meaning of a word. So pitch in English can change, you know, the emotionality of the word or the way that a sentence is kind of interpreted. Like, for example, if I said, I didn't say you're fat, I didn't say you're fat, I didn't say you're fat, you know, that's kind of these kind of like changes in pitch are changing the meaning, but fat always means fat. You know, it's not like if I say fat, it means fat, and if I say fat, then it means like pig or something, right? So, whereas in Japanese, it's that type of thing. And so as an English speaker, we're not predisposed to looking for connections between changes in pitch and lexical meaning. And when I say lexical meaning, it means that sense of like, it becomes a different word in the dictionary when the pitch changes. And the other thing with Japanese is that if you just ignore pitch accent altogether, you can still infer what words mean because of context, right? Like I just said before, the word for bridge and the word for chopstick, they sound the same other than pitch, but you can basically always tell from context, is he saying I'm going to cross the bridge or I'm going to cross the chopstick? You know, it's not really hard to tell. Or like another one is rain versus candy. Is candy falling from the sky or is rain falling from the sky? You know, normally you can always tell. And so people can end up getting really fluent in Japanese without ever acquiring this aspect of pitch accent because their brain just learns to get rid or solve any ambiguity just by relying on context.
How did you train yourself to put it another way, you had to develop this terrible habit of learning so much Japanese without inputting the pitch accent at the same time. How did you get yourself to be able to notice it?
Yeah. So just to elaborate on what you said a little bit, because I don't think we've actually explained this yet. For the bulk of my time learning Japanese, I wasn't paying any attention to pitch accent because no one told me that it was important. Like most Japanese learners. If you go and take a Japanese class in college or high school, or even you go to a Japanese language school in Tokyo, they don't tell you about pitch accent. And I think the biggest reason is just because they are assuming that you're a foreigner and you're never going to get that good anyway, so why even bother with another thing on your plate that technically you can get by without. So, yeah, I just was completely oblivious to pitch accent for the whole time I was learning Japanese. until I got really fluent and I was trying to figure out how I could close the gap between my current level and really sounding like a native speaker. And so I went up to one of my Japanese friends and asked them, you know, what is it about my Japanese that gives it away that I'm not a native speaker? And they told me that it was my intonation, or my intonation, that sounded weird. And I didn't really know what that meant. I interpreted intonation to mean the same thing it means in English, like the difference between I didn't say you're fat, I didn't say you're fat. You know, so it's like if I was messing up that level of thing, I didn't really know what to do about it. But then I kind of just randomly stumbled across some pitch accent content, and that was when it clicked that, oh, what he's talking about is pitch accent. And I realized later on that Japanese people, they all understand pitch accent perfectly, and when someone makes a pitch accent mistake, they instantly notice it and think that something sounds weird, but they call it intonation. They don't call it pitch accent, unless you're like a linguist in Japan. And so that I had this really rude awakening of like, oh crap, there's been this huge aspect of Japanese I was missing. And when I started kind of like learning more about it and testing myself, I realized that I had no awareness of this at all. Like, all the different words that like, you know, like I just mentioned, bridge versus chopstick, water versus candy, flower versus nose, like I couldn't hear the difference at all. They all sounded the same to me, basically. Or like I could hear that something was different, but I couldn't tell which one was which. And so the way I went about acquiring it was basically first just building a kind of intellectual model of how it worked, and then memorizing. So like basically there's 4 main pitch accent patterns in Tokyo Japanese, or standard Japanese. So I memorized which words were which pattern for like all the most common words. And then whenever I listened to Japanese, I just tried to hear it. And at the beginning, I couldn't really identify it and it wasn't really clear. But as I just continued to try to hear the patterns as I listened to Japanese, like for example, when someone said the word bridge, I would go, okay, so apparently the bridge is supposed to be pronounced with the Odaka pattern, and the Odaka pattern, it goes high up until the end, and then the particle attaches low. Let me see if it actually sounds like that. So I kind of created this deliberate practice loop where I had a task I was trying to improve at, which is perceive the pitch accent, and then I received immediate feedback in the form of, did what I perceive align with my mental model of how it was supposed to sound? And through this, I just got better and better at hearing it, and my mental model got more and more aligned with the reality of it. And it eventually got to the point where it was clear as day, and it was mind-blowing that there was ever a time that I couldn't hear it. And once that happened, well, then it was just kind of a matter of learning how to imitate, but at this higher level. Because, you know, like I said, when I learned how to start speaking Japanese, it was just a matter of imitating because I had seen Japanese spoken so much. But you can't imitate what you can't perceive, right? If you're oblivious to something, you're not going to be able to replicate it. So now that I could hear pitch accent, I was able to start imitating it myself. And also, like, whenever I would speak and I would say something that was off from a pitch perspective, it would start to sound off, and it'd be like, oh, that just sounds wrong. Oh, it's because the pitch is wrong. So I started to just have a better intuition for how it's supposed to sound by training myself to hear it and listening to more Japanese after I had learned to hear it. And I'm still far from perfect. In fact, it's probably the biggest thing that I wish I could improve further about my Japanese. But if you compare me to a couple years ago, before I trained myself to hear pitch, it's like night and day difference.
Is there anything else about Japanese that people haven't heard of? Like, of course, pitch accent is a huge one, but just in terms of, why do I sound off? Like, what am I missing?
Well, in terms of pronunciation, I mean, I would say the number one thing that people mess up is the vowels. Like when you hear a super bad Japanese, like a super bad American accent when you're listening to Japanese, like boku wa konnichiwa desu, kimi wa nihonjin desu ka? Like the reason why it sounds so bad is because you're using the Japanese vowels instead of the English vowels. Like a lot of times when you learn Japanese, they tell you like, okay, there's the vowel ah. It's like when we say like authentic, that ah, and then the e vowel. It's like, they're basing it off the most similar vowel in English, but they're all different. Like the Japanese ah sound, like in, the Japanese ah sound, like in aru, is totally different than the like ah in the word authentic. It's like ah versus aru. So if you just take someone with a really bad Japanese accent and you like clean up their vowels and make them like short and kind of stiff and align the same like tone as the Japanese ones, that'll make them sound a lot better. But outside of pronunciation, I'd say the biggest thing that people mess up is that they think in English and translate their English thoughts into Japanese. And that leaves you with something sounding unnatural 9 times out of 10. Like one example I always use is that in English, we say, I need to go to the bathroom. That's the most common way to express that idea. Whereas in Japanese, they say, toire ikitai, which you might literally translate as, I want to go to the bathroom. And so if you try to think in English and literally say, I need to go to the bathroom in Japanese, like, toire ni iku hitsuyou ga aru, or like, toire ni ikanakia naranai, or something, they'll know what you mean, but it'll sound super weird. So if you want to sound natural, you can't be translating in your head. You have to just know how Japanese people express that idea the first time.
That's funny that you mentioned that about the vowels, because I didn't realize that my vowels were so bad until I went to a voice training class. And then on multiple occasions, the teachers would always be correcting my vowels. I had this back and forth with the teacher. She was like, no, janakute no. No, janakute no. I was like, oh, no. And she's like, yeah, Amerikajin poi kara. No. Like you're kind of cutting the vowel off, right? Like you cut it off at the end rather than letting it extend.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because there's like the opposite thing that happens where when Japanese people try to say English, they add extra vowels onto the end. Like they can't end on a consonant. You know, like they can't say cup. It's always kappu. And they have to add the like pu at the end. And it's always like, why can't you do less? How come you're doing too much? It seems like it would actually be easier to do less. But then when we do the vowels, we do the same thing. We add on too much. It's actually harder to do less when you're used to doing more.
Yeah. It's like it just automatically happens. I had a friend who was saying, he has really good English, and he was saying, tish, can you pass me a tish? He was pointing to a tissue. He got so used to cutting off the vowels. Yeah, let's talk about how you were able to focus when you were in your all Japan all the time phase. You know, one, it's a curiosity because you'd think, okay, how effective is that? But then, of course, it takes a ton of diligence. Was there anything you used or incorporated in your life to strengthen your focus so well?
Well, at that time, it was really kind of just this obsession that I had. And part of it was that I found this blog on the internet called alljapaneseallthetime.com, where the author talked about how he immersed himself in Japanese from between 18 hours and 24 hours a day, because he counted sleep time. He listened to Japanese in his sleep, and that he got good really quickly. So something was just knowing that someone else did that and that it was possible, I think really sparked something within me. It's like, if he could do it, I can do it. But another thing is that when you do everything in Japanese, it actually simplifies your life in a kind of radical way, because you never have to make the decision, should I do English or should I do Japanese? Like, should I watch an American movie or a Japanese movie? It's like, you just do everything in Japanese by default. And it wasn't like I was studying the whole time. Sometimes I was just sitting and watching a movie, even if I didn't understand that much. And so, yeah, when you go all in, it in a way becomes simpler, because you don't even have to tempt yourself. It's not like you're going to go and watch a movie and then you have to have the discipline to like turn it off and turn off the English movie and turn on the Japanese one. It's like you just get rid of all your English stuff. You know, you get like, I was so removed from English. I didn't hear about Game of Thrones. I didn't hear about House of Cards and any of the shows that I later found out was popular at the time. So there was no temptation to watch it because I didn't know it existed. You know, I was in such a bubble that I only found out about other Japanese things because I was only doing Japanese things. So there is a power to really going all in like that for a period of time. Of course, it also can be very isolating and have negative social and mental health effects. But if you have a kind of robust mind and you're really serious about this, I think for a limited period of time, going all in can be good, because the other thing is the more you do per day, the faster you improve. And it's feeling your own improvement that really is the source of motivation when it comes to language learning. That's how I view it. And so when you do it all day, you get better really quickly, and that creates this really exhilarating sense of motivation, of just wanting to continue doing what you're doing and keep that momentum going, because you know that if you do, you're going to be noticeably better by next week, which isn't so far in the future. But yeah, now that I've kind of come out of that phase, and actually I've been learning Chinese for the last 6 months seriously. I've been learning on and off for a while, but I got more serious in the last 6 months. I've found it a lot harder to consistently stay motivated, because I'm only doing it, you know, maybe half an hour to an hour a day. And that's not enough to feel immense progress. And so a lot of times it feels like, at this rate, I'm never going to get really good, or it's going to take forever. So why even bother putting in the hour? You know, so I've kind of had to figure out a new structure of motivation and staying consistent, which I think is really important, because I know most of my viewers and most people trying to learn a language they're not going to have the opportunity or interest of doing it full time like I did. So it's important to find out how to stay motivated and focused. And I found that meditation helps me a lot, as well as just having a really structured learning plan, a kind of minimum that you set out for yourself to do each day that you know you can really commit to, and using that to kind of slowly build up your ability. And if you stay consistent with it, then you will what's the phrase? Slowly but surely. You will slowly but surely notice your own improvement, and that will motivate you to keep on putting in the time. And the better you get, the easier it is to spend time with the language. And so the more you can naturally up your time and move more towards being a little more intensive once you know it's not just you being lost in language and you're actually understanding most of the stuff you're coming across.
But do you feel like there's a point at which you were kind of burning yourself out and getting diminishing returns? Like, okay, I just did 7 hours of Japanese, I'm feeling kind of tired, I don't want to do this. So then you're just kind of like getting far less useful input because your brain is just so frazzled.
I mean, at the beginning, you also have to remember, I was like 17, 18 years old when I was doing this. So I was kind of insane in a way. It was, my insanity was in a helpful direction, but I was literally like, I don't even know if this is going to be helpful. Maybe it's not, but even if there's like 1% chance it's going to help me, I'll listen to Japanese for another hour. That was basically my mindset, because I was just balls to the wall. That was all I was doing, and I was fully committed. Later on down the line, I struggled a lot more with diminishing returns, because basically the better you get at a language, the harder it is to improve. You get like 90% of the way to fluency after the first year. After like 3 years, you're like, you've reached a really strong level of fluency in my case when I was doing it full time. And then after that, it's just like, you're trying to bridge the gap between you and a native speaker, but the difference is just so vast that, you might learn another 2,000 words and you hardly even feel the difference, because those words that you're learning are so uncommon, you only see them once or twice a year, So that made it a lot more tough. But at the beginning, you improve so quickly, because all the stuff you're learning is super common, super important stuff. So, you learn something in the morning, you hear it come up in a TV show in the evening, and you have the sense of like, oh, I understood that today, but I wouldn't have understood it yesterday. So it's really easy to keep motivated.
Last time we were talking about input, pure thought, and output, and then the conversion between the three. I can't remember exactly what you said, but I really liked what you said last time. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So I think basically the idea was what you're doing when you're learning to comprehend the language through getting input is you're building a little machine in your brain that takes Japanese as an input and then turns it into pure meaning or pure understanding and exports that as the output. Because when you think about it, like right now, anyone who's watching this video is probably fluent enough in English to where they're instantly understanding everything I'm saying, and there's no time lag, there's no effort required. In fact, you couldn't not understand me even if I wanted to. It's involuntary. That's how good you've gotten at understanding. So that's what I mean when you say you've built a little machine in your brain that converts English into meaning in that case, right? It's completely automatic. So once you've built that little box in your head through getting all this input, you can run that little machine in reverse and take pure thought or pure meaning as the input and have Japanese or whatever language you're studying be the output, right? Because that's what happens when we're speaking English is we have a thought and we just know how to say it in English. Not always. Sometimes we have to think about, how can I say this? But we're able to go directly from thought into language. And so that's kind of my subjective interpretation of how the process of learning a language through input works. You build the machinery by going from language to meaning, and then you can use the same machinery, like run in reverse, to go from meaning to output. And when it comes to actually learning how to speak the language, the way that I view speaking is that you can break it down into a lot of different skills, but most fundamentally, it's the process of, first of all, taking what you want to say, raw thought, and translating it into coherent words and sentences and paragraphs in the language. And then second of all, physically moving your mouth and throat and tongue in order to pronounce the sounds in order to create those words, right? So you can separate these two things and practice them in isolation. If you want to, in order to practice pronunciation, you can do an exercise called shadowing, which actually you've talked about on your channel in your video about input a couple years ago, where you basically just listen to a native input in your target language and you just repeat back out exactly what you're hearing, right? So you can listen to a podcast or a TV show and you're just saying out loud exactly what the characters are saying. And this allows you to practice moving your mouth in the right ways to make all the sounds and get the intonation patterns without having to worry about actually forming sentences yourself. And then when it comes to forming sentences yourself, writing is the perfect activity to do that, because what you're doing when you're writing is essentially just taking thoughts, translating them into words, but you're freed from the time constraint that a spoken conversation has built into it, and you also don't have to worry about pronunciation. So the way that I kind of went about building up my speaking, and I would recommend other people to go about building up theirs, is to kind of practice these two skills in isolation, get a habit of writing. And of course, literary writing is kind of a different story. But I mean, if you can go and write go write YouTube comments in your target language, maybe chat with some native speakers in a chat room or Discord server or something, and then do shadowing, and then you can put those two things together and you can be pretty verbally fluent right off the bat. Assuming that you have enough foundation and input.
I want to add one little thing and see if you agree with this to the model. Is you have the machine that'll run forwards and backwards to take input into pure thought or pure thought into output. But I think there's also a governor at the output point that's saying, oh, that sounds dumb, or oh, that's probably not right. How much of a factor do you think that is? Because people familiar with Japan, when you come here and start to live here, you'll start to notice that there's this huge focus on learning English. There's what's called eikaiwa, which is a English conversation. And this is like a huge business. These different places where you go in and you speak to native English speakers to improve your English. You go to the bookstore, there's like the same way there's a category for, say, fiction or nonfiction or mystery, there's going to be a category that's just English, and you'll just have like tons and tons of books for learning English. And kids are taught, I think they're taught from elementary school to high school. But then you get actually quite low language proficiency here. The general person, of course, there's people who are fantastic. And I think that's all to do with the way it's taught. It's very much like, here is the perfect way to speak English, and you need to replicate that for us. And then when you don't, we're going to penalize you with, I don't know, we'll get mad at you or give you a bad score. Did you struggle with that, or did you have to teach yourself to stop worrying about mistakes so much, or do anything to like relax that part of your brain?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that, like you asked if I'd agree with that addition in the model, and I definitely would. And in fact, that's one of Stephen Krashen's 5 hypotheses that make up the input hypothesis. I think he called it the monitor hypothesis, which basically says that, yeah, what really happens is when you go to say something, something pops into your brain from your subconscious, from what you've acquired, and then you can kind of edit that thing that popped up using your conscious knowledge before you say it. But what he said, and what I would agree with, is that what you can do with that monitor is very, very limited. And this is just because the bit rate of conscious thought is way slower than the bit rate of your unconscious mind. Like your unconscious mind, like for example, in English, there's this one really complicated grammar rule that determines the order of adjectives when multiple adjectives are modifying a noun. So for example, we say big red dog, but not red big dog, because of the categories of adjectives and the order that they should come in. So when I'm speaking English, I'll say big red dog and other similar sentences and follow the rule, no problem. But consciously, I wasn't thinking about that, right? It was my subconscious that understands that rule intuitively and organizes the adjectives so that they're in the right order. And when you think about how much like computational power that must take, it's actually quite a bit, right? Like if you were going to try to apply that rule consciously, it would take a lot of thought. There's no way you could do it in real time. So when it comes to using this monitor, it's just very limited. And in fact, like there's even times I try to use it in English. Like for a long time, I never said my brother and I are going to the store. I always said me and my brother are going to the store. And then eventually I learned the rule and I realized like, oh yeah, okay, it should be my brother and I. And so I try to remember to do that, but a lot of times I mess up, and sometimes I actually like apply it when it doesn't fit. You know, like when it should be me, I say I because my brain memorized the rule as like, just say I every time, you know, and it doesn't have that nuance because it's kind of like, it's not fast enough to think through it all the way. So, I mean, yeah, when I was learning Japanese, my kind of take on it was that you kind of just got to go with whatever your mind spits at you, and you don't have a lot of time to try to monitor it. And I mean, really, my experience when I was first starting to speak Japanese was that I would want to say something, and then a couple of different possibilities would pop into my mind at once. And I would have an intuitive sense of how confident I was in each of the possibilities. And so I would kind of go for the one that I was most confident in, even if it didn't totally match what I really wanted to say. So, you know, if I had a choice between saying something that really fit my original idea, but I didn't know if it was right or not, or maybe I was pretty sure it was wrong, versus something that was like a kind of similar idea, but also different, but I knew that it was correct because I'd heard Japanese people say it a bunch of times, I just go with that one. And I think that's important because at the beginning, sometimes your sense of what you want to say is shaped by English. And it takes a while for you to naturally like have Japanese style thoughts come up the first time. So for me, like, it wasn't really an issue. I think also because I didn't start speaking Japanese until I had like thousands of hours of input. So like I said, I was able to speak pretty fluently right off the bat. Whereas Japanese people, they're trying to force themselves to speak before they've had nearly enough input, in my opinion, right? Like if you actually look at a Japanese classroom and you try to calculate how many hours are they actually getting exposed to real comprehensible input in English, it's almost nothing. Like if you open a Japanese English textbook, it's 99% in Japanese. It's like all these super long-winded explanations of how the grammar is working. And so in a way, that's like, imagine the difference between learning how to swim and then like learning the physics of the human body, like the physical mechanics of the human body moving through water, and like calculating the pressure of how much an arm would have to move the body forward these many centimeters in water. Like, that's the equivalent of what Japanese people are doing with English. They're like learning all these high-level grammar formulas that even native speakers don't know, and like trying to translate Japanese into English using these formulas. And that has nothing to do with the process of building the subconscious machine that goes directly to and from meaning, right? They're all about consciously translating Japanese into English, and that whole thing doesn't work. You need comprehensible input and to acquire the language subconsciously.
That's what I really liked about that one English teaching school that I worked at. I was working there part-time when I was going to university. And they said, you can't use Japanese. Don't use any Japanese. And don't teach them grammar. Just talk to them in English. If they don't understand you, talk in only keywords or slow it down. And so I thought that was really good. You know, I think that's a huge point of it. Like you're saying, the textbooks, they're mostly Japanese. So what are they learning? They're learning more Japanese, not English. That reminds me of something we were talking about the other day, how people might think, okay, we should be speaking from day one. You gotta speak right away. Speak right away. That's the best way to learn. But one, that's not necessarily necessary. But two, the thing about Japan is, because people have committed so much time and energy to learning a lot of English, they actually have pretty good vocabulary and can kind of muscle their way through certain sentences or whatever they're trying to say. So, and they're, of course, very hospitable. So it seems to be that the perspective is that, oh, this person is struggling with Japanese. Let me try and bridge the gap. Let me help him out, and let's talk in English instead. So then that kind of makes it harder to, or sometimes some people just want to practice their English. They finally need to use it. So then it makes it harder to actually get into using Japanese, because people, if your Japanese isn't like fantastic, a lot of people will just be like, all right, well then let's talk in English.
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of people don't talk about that really kind of harsh and pragmatic reality when it comes to learning a language, where like if you're just trying to live your life, you probably aren't going to want to sit down and try to have a conversation with somebody who basically can't speak your language at all, right? At least not in that language. You know, that's not a pleasant experience at all. It's going to be very slow and frustrating. And so, I mean, I guess that's why it's getting really popular to go on websites like italki and pay a tutor to talk to you. And that kind of solves those social issues of like, how are you going to make a friend who you speak Japanese to when you don't speak Japanese and you don't want them to speak English to you, you know? But I still think that like before you have a foundation and input, the act of speaking is really the act of thinking in English and then consciously trying to translate that thought into Japanese using grammar rules that you memorize and stuff like that. And the result of that is going to be really unnatural language. And it's also just going to be slow and clunky. And no matter how much you practice that, it's never going to become the process of naturally being able to go from pure thought into natural Japanese. Because in order to do that, you have to actually just, like you mentioned at the very beginning, learn through pattern recognition. Give your brain thousands of hours of Japanese input and let it naturally, almost kind of like a machine learning algorithm, build a model of how Japanese works, which then you can use directly and intuitively. That's really how getting good at a language works. So you can speak at the beginning if it's motivating for you or it's part of your strategy of getting the necessary input. But if you just wait to start really focusing on speaking until you've had a foundation and input, you can go from 0 to fluency in like a week or two. And that was my experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is there anything else that we've missed regarding your philosophy on language learning? And tell us more about refold, or tell us about refold.
Yeah. So a couple of months ago, I started a kind of new language learning project called refold. Started with my friend Ethan. And so if you go to refold.la, we have this roadmap laid out where we break the whole language learning process into 4 stages, 5 if you count stage 0, which is kind of just the background and philosophy. And so if you want to take the ideas that I've been talking about in this interview about input and using the flashcards and learning to understand and then naturally learning how to speak really fluently, and you want to put it into a real structured study plan, then I think refold is going to be pretty much perfect for that. Basically, to give a really quick overview, stage 1 is just building a foundation in the basics of the language by learning the basics of the grammar and memorizing the most common 1,000 or 2,000 words in your target language so that when you jump into native content, you aren't totally lost. And then in stage 2, you jump into authentic native content like TV shows or movies, and you learn through looking words up and creating flashcards, and you grow your comprehension slowly but surely. And once you've reached a really strong level of comprehension, then you move on to stage 3, and that's when you work on shadowing and writing and then eventually speaking. And by the end of stage 3, you have basic fluency in the language. And then stage 4 is taking that basic fluency and continuing to refine it and getting as close as you're motivated to go when it comes to bridging the gap between yourself and a native speaker. But a lot of people will probably just be happy with the level of ability after stage 3, because that will be enough to, you know, work in the language, go to school in the language, and be able to have high-level conversations and really get all your needs met. So yeah, another thing I'll say is that the amount of time it takes to master a foreign language greatly depends on how different that language is from your native language. So assuming that you're an English speaker, if you're listening to this video, you can reach fluency in a language like French or Spanish or German in really like a year and a half or 2 years with only putting in a couple hours a day, like 2-3 hours a day, if you take this type of method. If you're talking about learning a language like Japanese or Chinese, then you have to either put in many more hours per day. Like I'd say I reached fluency in about 2 or 3 years in Japanese, putting in like 6 to 8 hours a day. Or you can just put in 2-3 hours a day, but expect it to take, you know, maybe close to a decade or something before you like really reach a near native level, but maybe around 5 years to reach like a really strong level of fluency, which sounds like a long time. It is a long time, but Japanese is really hard, and most people never get fluent in Japanese no matter how hard they try, which is the sad reality.
Make sure to check out Matt's channel, Matt vs. Japan, on YouTube. And if you're really interested in mastering a language, check out Matt's Refold project at refold.la.